Good evening. Yes, this is going to be exciting. I'm Jarita Holbrook. I'm part of the Science, Technology, and Innovation Studies here at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm currently the president of the International Society for Archaeoastronomy and Astronomy and Culture. We have three speakers today. Professor Timiebi Aganaba, killing it, is part of the School of the Future of Innovation and Society at Arizona State University. Timiebi has held many important roles, including working with the Canadian and Nigerian space agencies, the International Space University, and the World Space Week Association. Our second speaker is Brian Eno. He's an internationally recognized artist, perhaps best known for his musical successes. Brian uses his art to shift public perceptions of issues like global warming and climate change. And our last speaker is Aparna Venkatesan. I don't think I've ever said your last name before, Aparna. She's a cosmologist and professor of physics and astronomy at the University of San Francisco. Aparna works actively on developing scientific partnerships with indigenous communities and on advocating for a sustainable presence in near-Earth space and preserving the skies as a scientific, environmental, and cultural resource. Our first question goes to Professor Aganaba. In the context of environment and culture, what is our right to the sky? And should we care about our right to the sky?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. This is a fascinating conversation so far. So I'm basically a lawyer, so I think this rights discourse is very interesting. So essentially we have two proposed rights that are pushing against each other: the right to be connected versus the right to a dark and quiet sky. Now, I think COVID-19 showed us the extent of the digital divide problem, right? Those connected were able to maintain business or find new opportunities and continue their education. And those who were not, whether in rural areas, indigenous communities, or developing countries, found themselves further marginalized. So basically in 2017, the UN declared that it considers the internet to be a human right. So specifically, an addition was made to Article 9 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, basically stating this. Noble, but the question is, should this goal for the universal human right of internet be met at all costs? So accordingly, the participants in the International Conference in Defense and Quality of the Night Sky and the Right to Observe the Skies in a meeting in Spain in 2007 had a different view about what is an important human right, and declared that an unpolluted night sky should be considered as an inalienable right of humankind, equivalent to other environmental, social, and cultural rights. So now the International Astronomical Union have taken this issue of light pollution to the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, requesting that they protect the sky's darkness for the sake of future advancements in astronomy. But of course, astronomy is obviously just one stakeholder. But how do we balance these supposed conflicting rights? For the space industry, they argue that there is no hierarchy to space activities, right? That no one can say astronomy is more important than the internet, and everyone is free to explore space subject to the Outer Space Treaty. But as Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty highlights, the freedom of outer space is subject to the condition that space be explored and used for the benefit and interest of all countries. So in this case, what is benefit and who gets to decide? And we really must promote dialogue to ensure that not only do space activities continue to be beneficial for all humanity, but that includes deciding when increased activity is not in the benefit of humanity. So on the other hand, there are others who are arguing that we should start thinking of space as an environment to be protected. So some space sustainability advocates argue that the environment of space has value itself, or intrinsic value, and faces a much greater risk of harm than individuals on Earth. So while the question of intrinsic rights of nature, like rivers and trees and the like, have now been given legal protection in some jurisdictions, the question of the protection of the space environment is finally making it to court. And it's very interesting, as Amy slightly alluded to, Viasat is requesting an injunction or a motion to stay against the launch of SpaceX Starlink satellites, citing that the Federal Communications Commission are in violation of the National Environmental Protection Act. by not requesting an environmental impact assessment to determine the risk of Starlink satellites. Now, the question is, what is environment for the purposes of this NEPA Act? And does space qualify? And the big issue is that the qualifier to environment is that it must be a human environment. I mean, when I started digging into this, there are really interesting articles that focus on current understandings of the conception of human environment, especially in the context of Black Lives Matter, which focus on the non-physical effects to people. And as such, we can see that it is arguable whether the space environment is a human environment. I mean, it is certainly a domain, but is a domain an environment, and is a domain human? Humans operate in a domain, but is it all the same thing? But even more basic, when I think about this, it seems there's no available measure of what amounts to an environmental concern. So this may depend on human sociological and psychological factors, as well as the way a movement is portrayed as being environmental by proponents of the view. Basically, we need to come to an agreement if there is an environmental concern in outer space. Thank you.
Our next speaker, jumping right in, Brian, you have made your commitment to climate change and trying to encourage other musicians through your Earth Percent initiative. In your mind, what's the connection with the satellite pollution issue? Are they completely different problems or somehow connected?
I think they're very closely connected. This seems to me to be a question of how do we think about the commons? Now, what we've seen over the last 50 years in particular is that a lot of things that humans assumed were commons have now become privatized effectively. So we have this issue of that we've been destroying commons, things that all humans assumed were theirs, have in fact been turned into commercial zones which belong to people. And in fact, we're now sort of doing that with space. We're closing off space to the ordinary human. In fact, what I fear is that we're building a sort of cage around the Earth. If it's going to be 250,000 satellites, as I think Ruth said is possible, or even 500,000 satellites, doesn't that effectively confine us to this planet, not only psychologically, but physically as well? We won't be able to fly through that barrier. You know, if the amount of space junk that we can predict there is extrapolatable from what already exists, then we will have a sort of impenetrable barrier where most forms of vision and travel outside of our planet are prohibited. So this is one, it's a pragmatic problem, this. Are we caging ourselves in? But for me, the more important question is, are we caging ourselves in psychologically? Are we actually creating a smaller universe for ourselves? Are we shutting off the possibilities of actually feeling that larger universe? Now, because I'm an artist, I think that feeling is the beginning of thinking. I don't think it works the other way around. I think we feel first, and feeling is a form of thinking. And I think there is something very important about the fact that humans look into the night sky and feel their own tininess and insignificance and the amazingness of the universe that we're part of. I think we're closing that off. We're shutting that feeling off. We're saying, let's just carry on with the babble we've got here on Earth, and let's make it even more efficient. Now we can babble with even less latency and in even more obscure places. I'm not against babbling. I do quite a lot of it myself, but I also like the thought of going out into nothingness and looking into the darkness. So I won't talk for longer because I know there's a lot to say about this, but Timiebi is right that this is a legal problem, partly a legal issue. I would just want to say, let's not do to space what we've done to the oceans and to the great rainforests. Can't we just learn from those experiences and say, why don't we treat space like Antarctica? Why don't we say, it's a commons? We should share it, and we should make sure that it can be shared for a long time.
Thank you. And thank you for keeping to time. Okay, our last question is a long one. This is for Aparna. As we examine how astrophysicists, observatories, and other stakeholders are working to get the ear of the creators of these satellite constellations, it is poetic how there are parallels to the desire of indigenous communities that are contesting the continued use of their sacred mountaintops for astronomical purposes. This brings into question indigeneity and culture, and not only the right to the night sky, but the right to their ways of accessing the sky. Of particular concern is the classic false dichotomy of tradition versus progress, upon which first indigenous people and now astrophysicists are on the losing side. Can you speak about what you have learned from your work with indigenous communities that can help us destabilize this false dichotomy, as well as give voice to shared and dissenting positions in the satellite constellation discussions? Aparna.
I want to begin by respectfully acknowledging those whose ancestral homelands I am speaking to you from, the Coast Miwok and Ohlone of Northern California, as well as the traditional custodians of the land where each of you are. I also honor that 2020 brought us as a planet and species to an existential crossroads we have been approaching for some time, and that we are still navigating a time in which we are losing too many elders, especially in the most vulnerable communities. So I express my gratitude to the organizers of this event for holding the space and intentionality to discuss our shared elder space itself. Jarita, I agree. It's a painful irony that in studying orbital mechanics and radiation, that understanding is now built into technology that might actually hold up astronomers. And I think it's also a painful irony that it's come around to astronomy. Our institutions and facilities were and continue to be built on indigenous lands. And that is now threatened. Astronomy is threatened by the very real, very rapid occupation of near-Earth space by the satellite industry. And I'm especially grateful for this space because we've been a little slow to arrive at this. You know, our pace was, for Tolkien fans, entish, but we've now arrived and into dialogue. And the SatCon industry is very fast, but they're also capable of fast responsiveness. So we're hopeful of good collaboration. And I know after this past year, many of us are impatient to resume life and business as usual. But let's keep in mind that the constituency for space is humanity itself. And that space is an ancestral global commons, not just a global commons, but an ancestral global commons for all of our shared practices, scientific, cultural. And this is a really radical perspective shift for us ahead of policies to move away from viewing time and space as a scarce commodity needing a lot of heavy management. And I want to honor my collaborators and my work with Indigenous communities who model the partnerships that I'd love to see unfold in our approach to space that include and integrate our many human identities and knowledge systems. And they have shown me the wisdom and great need for a relational, ethical approach to space rather than a transactional, extractive approach. Indigenous knowledge is inherently interdisciplinary, multi-generational, and integrative, expressed through sustainable practices. This isn't just a nice idea. We actually direly need this approach given the existential crossroads we're at. And the realm of space agencies and billionaire investors exploring space, this is the heart of what makes us human. It isn't just the realm of these space agencies and private companies. All of our ancestors have been scientists and explorers, and it's the heart of what makes us human. And we have so much to learn from all traditions. So my respectfully offered thought is that we focus more on how we get there rather than being the first to get there, and that we ask who and what we are losing in gaining the stars in the current approach. And I'll end with advocating and joining you for moving away from divisive dualities, professional astronomy versus other constituents, rural versus urban, science versus culture. we can create the space for nuanced dialogues with communities and listen to them about what satellite mega constellations could bring them and may take away. What are their options and what alternatives are they considering? This isn't hard for us as physicists. We are used to paradoxes at the heart of reality. We can do this. For example, an electron we know acts as a wave and as a particle, and we know that we force a limited outcome. We choose one, choose one identity, something not reflective of a very complex whole, only through a measurement. So I'll end with this sentence, that science is inseparable from the cultural paradigms and values driving that science. And like the electrons, let's integrate that. Let's not have to choose.
Thank you so much, Aparna. Okay, so Andy, confirm that we have 2 minutes for questions.
Yeah, there's been some fascinating questions, so we should certainly pick a few.
Yeah, hi, just a very specific one to Brian first. The question is whether or not there is justification using art projects involving satellites, of which there have been several proposed and some launched over the years, as a way of engaging people to look at that contemplation of the universe, or whether that just sort of undermines the issue that we're addressing more globally here. Do you think it's valid to use art on satellites at this point, or should we just eschew that?
I'm not familiar enough with any of those projects to answer in any detail. There is a sort of slight contradiction possible in doing that. And I don't currently imagine that as an important extension of this argument. I think for me, the important thing is using art to honor the fact that we share lots of things together and to find ways of sharing them, not to find ways of fencing them off and keeping them for ourselves. Now, if those projects you're talking about help to do that, then I would support them. But I think it's something that artists are very aware of at the moment and are certainly doing in global terms, in Earth terms. I'm hoping that we'll start looking to the stars and thinking the same way about them as well.
Great. And one more question from Catherine Courtney came a little bit earlier on, and it's a rather global question, so I welcome anybody to pitch in. We don't just have a minute left. How do we engage younger people with this topic? This is a question for their futures as much as we are responsible for what's going on. I think about my own children here, and I'm not sure they're particularly engaged at all. They're not listening to this evening. They're just thinking Dad's doing what Dad's doing as usual. But it's vital because it's their world. This is, of course, a huge issue in many ways, climate change and many other global challenges. So Timiebi, maybe you would like to jump in there.
Yeah, so I think that sustainability is like a hot topic right now. So like, for instance, in my school, which is the College of Global Futures, we also have a College of Sustainability. And it's just the amount of people that are realizing that we have to take a holistic approach to the way we do things. We can't, for instance, say, oh, because the space environment is so far away, we don't have to have a sustainable way that we look at it. And so if we bring in that language of space, that actually it's just another area that is pretty close to what we do. And if we have to always think, holistically about what we do on Earth, then kind of why not in the space context? And as this sustainability becomes a more dynamic career, I think we just have to get that topic associated with space more than we do. And I think the space sustainability dialogue that we've had so far has been too focused on security. And so people feel like security is like really far away from me. But if you say, no, it's about environment and we're going to have more activities in space and more things are going to be affected, then more people are going to feel connected to that. So that's how I think we get the youth involved.
So thank you all our speakers. Handing it back to Andy.
Thank you. That really was an amazing session, as I hoped it would be.